The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back, and you are comfortably zoned with me, the Zig Zag Man, in Alameda, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, across the moat from Oakland, in the northern part of what I consider to be the greatest state in the world, and I'll get some arguments. My guests today are Comfortably Zoned Network regulars. They not only are podcasters in their own right, but they produce, so they're not just talking heads. And I had them in mind as a guest to celebrate the birthday of the great, GOAT, greatest of all time baseball players. He's 90 years old today, and he's all of our heroes in one way or the other, Mr. Willie Mays. So to join me in doing that, I'm going to introduce Matthew DiBiase. How are you, Matthew?
Pretty good, Ralph. Pretty good. Thanks for having me on, Ralph.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And Noel Hynd.
Hello, Ralph.
Hi. How are you? Welcome back to Comfortably Zoned. I hope you're healthy.
I am healthy as a horse and almost as smart. Yeah.
There are some smart horses, of course, and sometimes we go to the horse that we endorse or whatever the hell that was. Mr. Ed was smart enough to talk and smart enough to get his own podcast show, as a matter of fact. Whoa, Wilbur. Hey, listen, guys, it's Willie's birthday, May 6th, as we speak. And Matthew had an idea for a way to get into the show. Ask your question, Matthew. What's your idea? And I thought it was a great one.
If I never had the honor and privilege of interviewing Willie Mays, never even got to meet the man, but I don't know if he could answer it now, given his age and all that, but if, like years ago, if I could ask him one question, the one question I'd love to ask him is this. The early years when he was playing at Candlestick Park for the Giants, I'd like to know, when it was an open-shelled stadium, how many fly balls did he hit? Potential home runs did he lose due to the Bay Area winds simply because Candlestick Park was an open-shelled stadium? I mean, in other words, if he had done any other ballpark, it might have been home run balls, but how many did he lose at Candlestick due to the winds there? Because I think, looking at the construction at Candlestick, he must have lost fly balls, because I used to read stories about guys would hit fly balls and they would blow it all over the place, sometimes from the outfield all the way back to the infield because of the Bay Area winds. And I would just love to ask Willie, how many did you lose a year simply because when Candlestick Park was an open-shelled stadium? The answer would be fascinating, because the fact that he only hit...
Let me ask Noel Hynd what Willie's answer would have been.
Well, from what I know about him, he was not one to blow his own horn that much. But I think he would have probably said, he probably would have lost a couple of dozen. I saw an estimate by somebody who followed the Giants in San Francisco in those years. And don't forget, I rarely saw him in those years because someone had moved him out of town. The estimate was maybe 25 or 30 over the, conservatively speaking.
Wow.
That's could be low, could be high, but he certainly didn't gain any by being there. So I would guess a couple of dozen, maybe 3 dozen or so.
The Polo Grounds, unless you were a strict pull hitter, which Willie wasn't. He'd hit to the opposite field. He'd hit to the alleys. And the Polo Grounds was not very good for hitters as well. I'm sure he lost a lot of home runs there, as well as...
The thing is, you have to figure, I mean, he hit 50-some, what was it, 52 or something in that really great year that he had at the Polo Grounds?
51 in 1955. He did that, yeah. So,
you wonder whether, a guy who hit 50-some had lost some, but... if he didn't pull, they would have been outs, but he probably had a few inside the Parkers in that place too. So it might have evened out.
Good point.
I can remember several times when he was able to pull the ball or just swat it the other way when I watched him as a New York Giant in 56 and 57. So, part of hitting is adapting to your ballpark. So that's part of the skill. So I think Candlestick probably hurt him more than the Polo Grounds did.
Yeah.
Okay.
One thing about Willie Mays, though, is during the Polo Grounds years, 3 times he led the National League in triples there. So in a sense, if he couldn't get home runs, at least he was using the cavernous spaces of the Polo Grounds to hit triples there. I mean, 13 and 54 and 55, he had 20 triples and 57, considering, the fact that that many, especially in the home run era, that's pretty extraordinary.
Well,
yes,
let's not forget that Aaron and Mays were both hitters. Clemente, too. Robinson, all of them were hitters first and then home run hitters. There were very few guys that were just purely sluggers. Ralph Kiner comes to mind. Ted Kluszewski. Killebrew comes to mind.
Yeah.
Johnny Mize a little earlier.
Yes.
Very true.
Yes.
Yeah.
And one of the beauties of the game that we miss in those days, from those days, was that it enabled ball players to show all of their skills. They're running, they're going from when to run, their base running skills, let alone their speed. More was made of their arms than today. It's just a different game, and the name of the game is to elevate the swing and get more home runs, and it comes to the point now where it seems it's either a strikeout or a home run. You never hear the expression, get them on, get them over, and
going back to a point that Matthew made a moment ago. Looking at the numbers right now, and the Mays led the league in triples in 54, 55, and 57. He had 20 in 1957, and he also had 38 stolen bases, only 26 doubles. So you had to figure he was on second base an awful lot if he hadn't run past it just to start with. Scored 112 runs that year. That's a lot of times going across the plate.
Yeah, I mean... Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Ruff. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask Noel, did you ever interview him? And
no.
What question would you like to ask him if you had the opportunity?
Well, I could ask him whether just to kind of break the ice, I could say that the first time I saw him in person was in June of 1957, and did he remember seeing me in the stands? I know the answer to that would have been no, but I sure remember seeing him bat. I would maybe ask him about, gosh, there'd be so many things to ask him about. I think when I saw him play in person, which was at the Polo Grounds twice, and then later when the Giants came, and then later at the Polo Grounds when the Giants came into New York from San Francisco, and then later throughout his career, there was always an excitement when Willie Mays was coming up to the plate, more than almost anybody else, except maybe Aaron later on in the 70s. And I would ask whether he felt it also, whether it was an excitement that coming up to play, to hit, that started out with him and then spread to the ballpark, or whether he got off on it, or whether he was just so focused on hitting that it was kind of an ordinary part of his world. That's a pretty damn long-winded question, but I would have gotten it out some way. And assuming he was still awake, he probably would have gotten an answer.
Yeah, here's the thing to add to Noel what said about the excitement factor is the thing I remember reading about as a kid. The thing was, I first became aware of Willie. I mean, seeing him in his final season in '73. That's when I first became aware of baseball. Sadly, it was of course, his retirement season. But reading about him was that, like Noel said, the excitement he created was he was such a catalytic presence on the diamond, like especially on the base paths. I remember reading this account of his performance in the '66 season by Arnold Hanno, the sports writer. He said Mays could steal wins simply by daring. He would round like second or third base and challenge the outfielders. Okay, where do you think I'm going to go? And then dare the outfielder to make the wrong throw, and then he would steal the extra base or get that extra run because he was challenging the outfielder there. And how many times would he steal wins for the Giants simply because of his audacious base running? I mean, that's another key factor to Mays' greatness as a player, was his audacity and his courage and his ability to steal wins and steal runs, in key moments simply because of his diamond genius, his baseball IQ. I think that's another key factor in Mays' greatness as a player.
I would agree with that, and what you're doing is sort of echoing what Leo DeRocher said when famously asked how long he ever saw Willie Mays in a slump, and DeRocher said about 20 minutes. It was that just throwing in my own 2 cents, I can't remember ever seeing Willie Mays make a bad play. I don't remember one. I can. Well, it's like, go ahead.
He was a streaky hitter, but you wouldn't realize he was in a slump because while he was down hitting wise, he was helping the team in 30 or 40 different ways.
Yeah.
He was, and especially his most unheralded tool was his ability to take over the club and manage it from center field.
Yeah.
And he was like a manager on the field. He would steal signs. He would tell people where to play, give signals. And he was electrifying. I could remember, and I did see him a number of times at the Polo Grounds with the Giants in his prime. I saw him in his second prime because I moved out to the Bay Area, so I got to see him in the second prime too. He was an entertainer. He loved the thrill of the crowd. And I think he'd answer your question, Matthew, or I don't remember, it could have been Noel's question, was he electrified by the crowd or did the crowd electrify him? I think he was electrified. I think he was electrifying himself. And in return, the crowd would respond. But it started with him, and he knew it. And the one thing I will say about Willie, he had an incredible ego. Yeah. If you talk to him in his retirement days, he'd talk about who is the greatest and this, that, and he said, I don't want to brag, but he'd acknowledge it was him. He had no problem with that. Let me tell you guys what I would ask him. I would ask him how he was able to interact with Alvin Dark after the Johnny Roseboro days and the Cepeda days when Dark was saying things that were so antiquated and racist and crazy. You got to remember that Dark was the captain when Mays came up. He was my boyhood hero. The shortstop of your favorite team as a kid is going to be your hero for a long time. He was a great shortstop. He was every bit as good as Reese and Rizzuto. If they belong in the Hall of Fame, which is questionable, he belongs in the Hall of Fame. I'll put it that way. But for him, a black man to deal with him, his craziness, I would have been curious how he dealt with it all. Is that a good question?
Know. I mean, I'm looking at it this way. Apparently, when Dark named him captain, Dark told Mays directly, said, "You deserve it. You should have had it long before this." So, considering Dark, I know I remember reading, he had the today we would deem Neanderthalic statements about African Americans and Latinos and all that. But I often wonder it was just the sheer talent of Mays. In other words, Dark could look past that because, in other words, you see the greatness as it were. Whatever your private feelings were, you realize, hey, this is a great player, and hey, Dark played in two World Series for the Giants, thanks to Willie Mays in 51 and 54. So how can you not stand up and cheer when you see the greatness of Mays on that playing field as a teammate and later as a manager? So,
no question. I was just curious about how he was dealing with him when Dark was his manager, and there was all kinds of problem. Noel, what's your response to that?
Well, what I remember from the statement that Dark made that got him in trouble, I think it was reported by Newsday. I'm recalling it from the time that it, hit the New York papers. I believe Dark excluded Mays from his statement. I think he said that Mays was an exception, but of course that doesn't really soften the statement at all or the attitude. My guess, and I might be wrong, is that Mays probably would have tried to deflect the question and try not to dwell on it. Everybody has friends who say stupid things. That was a particularly stupid thing, but it was not, unfortunately it tied in with what a lot of people still thought. So, don't know. It's pure conjecture.
Yeah, and Willie was never one to expound, controversially in the press. He just kind of avoided it whenever possible. I mean, he was trying to rise above it all when you think about it.
Yeah, and just keep it on baseball. It's one reason why so many people probably liked him. He stayed away from the controversial stuff. When other guys had to do it. I mean, let's face it. In his day, a lot of people did not like Jackie Robinson. They did not like Muhammad Ali. They thought Frank Bill White, he called his book uppity because people thought that he was uppity. A lot of the early black players who stood up for themselves had negative input on a lot of white fans, and Mays was able to get past all of that. Partly through ability, but partly because other people fought the wars. So, yeah, I agree. I think he would have tried to sort of slide through it. How he felt personally is another matter for private.
Another thing, especially in this day and age, is that Mays, we tend to forget this, that, from 51 to 64, Mays had to compete in the Jim Crow era, because the Civil Rights Act was passed in '64. I mean, like Aaron, like Frank Robinson, like Jackie. Today, I mean, in a sense, today's players don't understand what's it like. The pressure you have to compete. While dealing with racism, overt racism, and Jim Crow, especially like in spring training and all that, and even in some cities when you were playing in the major leagues, and not only that, to excel, because back then there was no such thing as a marginal African American player. In other words, if you couldn't excel, they wouldn't take you. The white guy would get the job instead. So if you were marginal, if you couldn't excel, you were sent back down to the minors or never given a chance at all. So the pressures on Willie were even more enormous. But the fact that he came through, like Aaron came through, and Clemente came through, and Frank Robinson came through, that's is another aspect of how extraordinary his accomplishments were. I mean, imagine Barry Bonds having to play, during Jim Crow. How would he have coped with that? How would he have coped in an era where, like Mays, he had to cope with the beanball? I mean, hey, Drysdale would throw at his head, and other guys would throw at his head, and that was acceptable baseball back in those days. Whereas Barry Bonds could come to the plate with that heavy battle armor, the elbow guard, the thick helmet, and all that, the leg guard. I mean, Mays didn't have that. He didn't have that stuff at all, and he had to cope with that, and he was able to succeed despite that. So that's another pebble on the pile of that makes him so great, that tips the scales for his greatness.
Yeah. Right. And best about cities that were unaccepting. You're a Philadelphia guy. Philadelphia and St. Louis were not very kind to blacks of Robinson, Mays, anyone in those days. Yeah. So we've come a long way as a nation, and yet we haven't come a long way. Does that make sense?
No, you're right. It's like the best of times and the worst of times. In some ways, we still, I hate to say it, we still haven't grown up as a nation. Talking about racism, I posted something earlier, about Willie, is that, it wasn't just the Giants who had their eyes on Willie. There were four other teams that actually hypothetically had a crack at Willie. The Yankees could have had Mays, but the fact that he was black, no, they didn't. They refused to sign him. The Red Sox had a shot at Willie Mays, but again, thanks to the racism of Tom Yawkey and Joe Cronin, he was out of Boston Red Sox. And I'll tell you what, if he had been in Boston, he would have broken Ruth's record. And Fenway Park, that short porch, he would have broken Ruth's record. Now, if he had been a Yankee, I don't think he would have hit 660 home runs. Not with that deep left center in Yankee Stadium that's 457 feet. No, just as it swallowed Joe DiMaggio's home run balls and Mickey Randall's home run balls. I think Willie definitely would have lost more home runs. He wouldn't have had 660. Not an old Yankee Stadium, not like that. But even the Dodgers. I mean, I read something. Jackie Robinson tipped off Branch Rickey. Hey, there's this 16-year-old kid with the Birmingham Barons named Mays. But the Dodgers, they lost their shot. I mean, the idea of putting Willie Mays in Ebbets Field, now that would have helped. His home run ball totals probably would have increased significantly. With that bandbox at Ebbets Field, definitely so. If he had been a Dodger.
Yeah, but like with Snyder, it would have cut down on his showcase casing in the outfield. I think the great Willie would not have been considered as great as he was, just as Snyder was hurt because he couldn't, and he was a good outfielder. You could tell us more about that. No, was he every bit as good as Mantle and Mays, Duke Snyder?
Defensively, or just an overall player?
Defensively.
I don't feel that he had the range and the foot speed that Mays and Mantle had. And, it's funny, I got into this conversation on one of the Facebook sites the other day, and I frankly feel it's almost a cheap shot. The ballpark that Snyder played in, while there was some deep parts of it, it just didn't require someone to to have the range. So,
right.
Why criticize him for not demonstrating it? Maybe he would have learned the range or something. I don't want to knock Snyder in any way, and to some degree he always sort of comes across that, the Dodgers had Snyder, but the Giants had Mays, the Yankees had Mantle. Again, I would rank, you didn't ask me, but I'll give you my opinion anyway. I would rank Mays and Ruth as the two greatest players who ever played. That's always a good thing to say if you want to start a baseball argument, but I certainly can defend it. So, is that a rap on Mantle? Is that a rap on Hank Aaron? Is that a rap on Ty Cobb? But no, that's the way I see it in terms of, being complete ball players.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who of the two, Noel, do you consider to be great, or Mays or Ruth?
The greater of the two? Is that your question?
Yes.
I would opt for Ruth for several reasons. One, I think he would have made the Hall of Fame as a pitcher if he hadn't made it as a hitter. Two, you have to realize that in the fallout from the Black Sox scandal in 1919 and 1920, Ruth saved baseball. It's as simple as that. He ushered baseball from the teens, from the dead ball era, into the wildly successful 1920s. He became an icon, obviously, in his time. He was on the front pages of the paper. Even, I was just researching something in old copies of the Boston Post where my father worked in 1920. Babe Ruth in New York was a front page story on all the Boston papers. They would show their readers on the front page what Babe Ruth was doing. So I would opt for Ruth, and I would listen to arguments from people who want to talk about Ty Cobb and want to talk about Willie Mays. But that's my argument for Ruth.
Yeah, the fact that he was such a magnificent pitcher. I mean, that's such an extraordinary. I mean, what would happen if Mays had been a pitcher? I mean, if Willie Mays could pitch and pitch extraordinary like Ruth did, then you could postulate, Mays as the greatest of all time. I mean, there's even the speculation about the great Negro League player Oscar Charleston, because Buck O'Neill, one of those historians said that Oscar Charleston was Mays in the 1920s. In other words, 20 to 30 years before we saw Willie Mays, Charleston was Willie Mays in an earlier incarnation, as it were, because everything Mays could do, Oscar Charleston could do. He had the power of Ruth, the fielding ability of Tris Speaker, and the speed of Mays on the base pass. So, if you could do sabermetrics on Charleston, how would that compare to the say, hey kid, as it were, in that sense. But I think, the idea of putting Mays and Ruth, as the top two, I would concur with that, definitely, absolutely, yes.
Okay, I have a question for you guys, because I'm asking this because he was Mays' hero growing up. How does Joe DiMaggio fit into the conversation that we're having?
Well, if you rank the top 20 ball players ever, you're talking about some pretty fantastic ball players. So, again, I would put DiMaggio certainly up there, maybe among the 10 greatest. But just in overall accomplishment, what got done, and even keeping in mind that Mays lost 266 games by being in the U.S. Army. If he had hit 40 home runs in those, basically a season and a half or a season and 3/4, if he had hit 40 home runs, that would have put him at 700. Right there.
Yeah.
Well, let's not forget, though, that DiMaggio lost some precious time during the war.
He lost 3 seasons. He lost 3 seasons. The thing about DiMaggio is the problem was the brevity of his career. Remember, he only played, 13 seasons, whereas Willie played 22. And here's another thing. He lost 3 seasons to World War II, and the fact that he's a right-handed hitter in old Yankee Stadium, where I mentioned before, that deep left center field, that Death Valley and 457 feet, the deep left center, that cost him home runs. I mean, if you put Joe D in Fenway Park or like Crosley Field or whatever. Good parks for right-handed hitters, or Tiger Stadium, or something like that. Now, how many more home runs could he have hit? But again, the stresses of his career, though. I mean, he carried a lot of stress, and I often wonder if that's what shortened his career, though, the psychological load, because he was such an internalizer and all that. I mean, I know my father, growing up as a West Philly Italian, when you ask him who was the greatest of all time, there could be only one answer. That was Joe D. And that, because, hey, he was my father's idol and all that. But the fact was, I mean, the thing is, Joe DiMaggio was a good base runner, too. Even though his stolen base totals don't even come close to what Mays did, he was a smart and brilliant base stealer. I remember reading in a book, Joe McCarthy, his old manager, said Joe D. could have stolen 70 bases a season, but he didn't have to. But he had that potential. If necessary, he could have done it, if necessary. But it wasn't necessary, though, because So who knows? But the thing is, I know Bill James, he put Mantle above DiMaggio, if I recall correctly. If I read the thing, I think in his baseball abstract, he put Mickey above Joe D. So, and all that. So,
I remember the famous sports writer Leonard Coppett.
Yeah.
His essay comparing Mantle and Mays, and short-term Mantle. I mean, this guy, had he been healthy, this, that, and the other thing. Long-term Willie Mays. That's the conclusion that the esteemed author and sports writer Leonard Coppett came to. Is there anything that stands out in your mind that most people don't know about Willie Mays, Noel Hynd? Oh.
No. Did we lose Noel?
I think we did. So why don't you answer that question?
Okay.
No, we're having trouble. Are you back?
I just pulled. I think I had a problem with earbuds, but I heard your question, so let me answer it. One of the things that I was thinking earlier today, for many years in the late 60s and early 70s, the discussion was, let's say up until 1970, one of the discussions among people who followed baseball was whether Willie Mays was going to break Ruth's career record, because Mays was in front of Aaron significantly as the decade proceeded. And I can remember having a conversation with my father, invoking the name of Henry Aaron. And, we lived at the time in the New York area, and he wasn't even that familiar with Aaron. He knew who he was, but he was not really watching those home run totals. And Mays' numbers were starting to go down, and Aaron, while he never hit 50, it was always in there with 42, 43, 44 every year. And he was, I guess was he younger, or had he just, he'd started a little later, I think.
Yeah, no, he did start later. Mays was older.
Yeah, 3 years older than Hank Aaron. And to add to what Noel was saying was that, at the end of the 66 season, because I have this little booklet, The Great Stars, Baseball Stars, and Arnold Hano's article discussed, can Willie do it? Can he? Because at the end of the 66 season, he had 542 home runs, needed 173 to beat Babe Ruth. And Hano was breaking down the numbers, saying Willie has to hit X amount for the next 6 years, or if he hits 40 or more, he only needs X amount of time. At that time, at the end of the 66 season, he was 100 home runs ahead of Aaron. Aaron had 442. Mays had 542. But here's the difference. From 67 to 73, Mays aged badly. I mean, there was a drop-off there. I mean, that 66 season was the last time he ever cracked above 30 home runs. Meanwhile, Aaron was blessed because he was just starting to go at Atlanta, the launching pad there at Atlanta's Fulton County Stadium. And unlike Mays, he aged well. I mean, his home run totals, like Noel said, he was still hitting his 35, 37, 40, 44 home runs, steady and consistent. And that is the key factor to why he broke Ruth's record and not Willie Mays. Because, heck, by 72, he actually passed Mays on the home run derby there. I mean, so that's the key factor as to why Aaron and not Mays broke Ruth's record, because Aaron, unlike Willie, was able to age well as a player. And he was blessed by the fact that he ended his, with the exception of the last two seasons with the Milwaukee Brewers, end his career at Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, which was conducive to his home run power. And even Mays said, they asked him, can you break Ruth's record? He said, no, I don't think so. But he said Aaron's going to do it because he has that sweet swing and he's got that friendly fence in Atlanta. So he predicted it.
Yeah. I think when Mays, correct me if I'm wrong, but when Mays was up when Mays passed Williams and Fox, he would have been in second place, wasn't he?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
And of course, Aaron was still back in the pack a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, Aaron didn't crack the 500 thing until 68. Yeah, he had 510 by the end of 1968, which is extraordinary. I mean, it was just, and he just kept pouring it on. Heck, he had 47 home runs in 1971. He was 37 years old at the time. I mean, it was his best home run hitting season. He never cracked 50, but he was just so consistent. He just, you knew he was good for at least 34 home runs a season every year. Just steady as she goes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
It reminded me a little bit of Musial, who I don't think ever hit more than 39 in a season, but yet was on the all-time list.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing was, he didn't start becoming a home run hitter till the 48th season. He could have been, but it wasn't necessary. Eddie Dwyer told him, we need you to hit more home runs. He said, okay, that's exactly what I'm going to do. And he hit 39 home runs.
Yep.
Just did it, man. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah.
I'm going to broach a subject as we get later in this, and not much time. Willie doesn't seem to have the joy that one would have hoped. He seems a bit of a bitterman over the course of his career, and I don't know if I'm imagining that. If a lot of it is the press, a lot of it is the relationship with his godson. Can you address that, Noel?
I've heard stories about that also, and the most that I know is that I've had people off the record tell me that Mays feels that over many years, a lot of the people he has dealt with are just trying to use him for one thing or another, and it's not really whatever they want him to do. It's not in his interest. They're just trying to make a profit off of him, and I can see how a certain bitterness would set in from something like that.
Yeah. I mean, the fear of exploitation and all of that. I mean, it was the same with Mickey. So many people were saying, gimme. After a while, you have to develop that battle armor and all that, not letting the mask slide down and all of that. Having to show show the side, as it were. I mean, you often wonder. I mean, you read that thing where you would have dizzy spells. I mean, no, did anyone ever get an explanation why, like in the early '60s, he would have like those dizzy spells? Was it stress factors? Because didn't he have like
I've heard it was exhaustion. He just play every day, play out of his body, and a lot of it was that. I also heard stories about Willie's red juice and how a concoction of speed and what have you mixed together in a brew would oftentimes pull Willie through. So but the thing is, he had some after Leo left.
his relationship with his subsequent managers was uneven. Like with Bill Rigney, if I recall correctly, it was kind of iffy and so-so. Herman Franks, I think, was pretty decent. I think Dark was pretty decent, but I think was like Charlie Fox. He had trouble getting along with Charlie Fox. Even with Yogi, when he was with the Mets, there was like a semi-uneasy relationship between him and Yogi, if I recall correctly. It wasn't exactly perfect. I remember reading, was it Fox? He had trouble getting along with Charlie Fox. So it was always kind of like iffy there, in certain respects there with some of the guys who replaced Leo DeRocher afterwards, in my view. I mean, Noel, did you ever hear similar things?
Yes, I did hear similar things, and it's kind of one of the ironies and contradictions, because if there was ever a guy who was difficult to get along with, it was Leo DeRocher, and yet to Mays, he was probably the best the best manager, the most insightful. I was just reading earlier when I was doing a little homework before the show how DeRocher said, "Stop trying to pull the ball," in the Polo Grounds, and it kind of DeRocher just had a knack of bringing him along and maybe guessing right. I mean, even apparently the footwork. He got Mays to straighten out the stance, keep the feet a little closer in the Polo Grounds, relax. And, of course, there was the famous time when DeRocher just pulled him into the washroom by the dugout because Mays was so upset about, not getting a hit. And DeRocher said, as long as I'm here, you're the center fielder, you're starting. That's the end of the discussion. Get back out there. I'm with you all the way. And this is, what he needed. And, we all remember people who, when we're 20 or 18 and scared, the older guy who comes in and kind of puts you on the right track and stands behind you. And that's, I think nobody could ever really surpass DeRocher that way. And when Mays got older, he probably felt, you don't really need to be managed. Just put me in the lineup and I'll win the game for you. Yeah,
precisely. I mean, Millie, you were talking earlier about Mays giving signs. I remember reading articles about him, was it 80 or in the 90s, where he would say he would tip the pitcher, the Giants pitcher. In other words, okay, throw this type of pitch here, make him hit it to me. He would literally manipulate like the infield and the pitch selection to make sure he would be in position to make the proper outfield play, as it were. I mean, he was signaling. He was like a manager on the field, as it were. I mean, he told Al Lanier, be more aggressive, going for pop flies or like this or like that. He was like the unofficial manager on that field there. So he was he was such a leader. I mean, in many ways, he was more of a manager than, the other Giant managers, with the exception of DeRocher. I mean, he was like that field general there. He was that inspiration. I mean, DiMaggio was the same way. He, too, was a leader on that field, controlling the flow of the game, dictating how it should be dealt, how it should be played and all that.
Yeah.
Okay. Are we in agreement that Mays is the greatest player all three of us has ever seen?
Oh, certainly, yeah. And believe me, I've seen some pretty good ones.
Yeah, I mean, I loved Hank Aaron, but yeah, you got to go with Mays, though, in terms of the totality, the absolute totality of his talent. Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Good way to end a great podcast, gentlemen.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, beautiful.
Thank you both. It's the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I got to be the luckiest guy in the world. I just, trust me, I have had goosebumps all through this, talking to mavens, pure mavens, about Willie Mays on his 90th birthday.
Yep.
Whoa. We all want to be 90.
Yeah.
We'll never be Willie Mays, but we could live to be 91.
Yep.
And that's what it's about. Thanks again, guys. Thank you for listening, everybody. Again, Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, Noel Hynd and Matthew DiBiase. I'm Ralph Tycho.
Happy birthday. Say hey, kid.
Yes, absolutely. Ralph Tycho, I have to identify myself. I'm the weak link of it all. Absolutely that. Be well, and Glad you all got through the pandemic. Keep it up.
Amen.
Thank you, Ralph.
See
Take
you
care.
soon.
Take care, Ralph. Love you, man.
Thanks for listening, everybody. It's been a pleasure for me. Hope you enjoyed it as much.
Take care.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.